Welcome to the opening session of the mini-conference called The Future of the Global Infosphere. Today, focus will be on the thinking and ideas of Teilhard de Chardin. My great pleasure to introduce a spectacular person, my friend Ed Tywoniak, who teaches at St. Mary's College in California, not far from here. Ed has also been past president of the Media Ecology Association. He's a person that understands media, and now he's going to tell us about the medium Teilhard de Chardin. Take it away, Ed.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all. It's really a wonderful pleasure to be here today and in general at this conference filled with such wonderfully stimulating ideas. And I'm also especially honored to be able to be the introductory presentation for this mini-conference in which we'll be talking about the global infosphere both this morning as well as throughout the day tomorrow. So a lot more to go over in the next day and a half. My comments will be short and somewhat broad to try to set the stage and provide some context for the things that we'll be hearing later. But I have to start off with a bit of a disclaimer. This is fake news up here on this slide. It has me listed as Professor Emeritus. That doesn't kick in for 25 more days, but who's counting? I'm retiring June 30th, and I can't wait to actually assume the mantle of Emeritus. It's going to be wonderful. The four things that I'm going to be presenting in my brief comments include setting the stage for, as I mentioned, the things that we'll be seeing later today and tomorrow. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Teilhard himself and his concept of the noosphere. I'm going to put it into kind of a broader context, especially within my own field of research media ecology. And I also am very excited to later on introduce my colleague and friend Ben Kassira, who is one of the sponsors for the conference here this week and an integral part of the research we've been doing at St. Mary's College on global consciousness in our WM Keck Digital Media Lab that I run there at the college. As a communication professor and scholar, my views and perspectives will be somewhat humanistic, looking at kind of the dialectic process and perspectives on the question of global consciousness. And lastly, by way of introduction, I want to thank Bob Logan for his structure of this mini-conference. He was integral in putting this together. When Ben Kassira and I, a year ago, began working on our Human Energy Global Consciousness project, we identified four people who we knew we would eventually want to bring into the fold because of who they were and what they represented in this field. Terry Deacon, no stranger here at this conference. Francis Heiligen, I want to thank him. He's not here right now, but, oh, there you are. Thank you for your wonderful words, and you were an inspiration to all of us in our work this past year. Bob Logan, you'll be hearing from tomorrow, and Brian Swim, I'll have the good fortune of introducing after me, so you'll hear a little bit more about him later. But the four of them, again, were integral in our understanding and framing of what we were trying to do, which is, again, looking at this question of cosmic consciousness. One of my favorite slides here that shows a photo taken 9 years ago, I guess now, in San Francisco at the worldwide unveiling of the Apple iPad. It's only been around 9 years. It seems like it's been forever. And a famous quote from Steve Jobs, "Technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the results that makes our heart sing." And I think ultimately at the end of the day, we can make computers that sing, but do they sing in a meaningful way, showing consciousness? And I think Jobs, in his entrepreneurial way, was asking just those questions when he came up with this quote. Hang on 1 second here. I want to. One of my here it is. My slides got a little mixed up here. As a media ecologist, I am a student of Marshall McLuhan, a name that many of you are no doubt familiar with. He was, along with Neil Postman, the founder of what we call media ecology, the understanding that we live in media environments. We don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish. A fish doesn't know any other medium other than his water environment. And once you take her out and she starts to flop around for lack of water, only at that moment is there even an awareness of a change of environment. Similarly, remove us from our mediation environments, and we too quickly begin to flop around. This is all part of Marshall McLuhan's early vision of what media and the environmental aspects of media represent. He most famously put it into his aphorism, "The medium is the message." He came to this as an outsider to media studies. He is considered the godfather of media studies, but he was a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature that somehow he eventually got turned on to studying mediation, and eventually led him to be labeled by Wired magazine as the patron saint of media. In 1964, 55 years ago, almost 30 years before the World Wide Web ushered in the 21st century digital age, Marshall McLuhan predicted that we as a species were approaching, quote, "the final phase of the extensions of man, the technological simulation of consciousness, when the creative process of knowing and being will be collectively and corporately extended to the whole of human society." Francis was talking just a little bit ago about the question of internal and external, and McLuhan was looking at that early on. Bob Logan and I are working on a project right now on one of McLuhan's 4 laws of media. One of them is the concept of reversal, how we move from, say, figure to ground, how we move from percept to concept. Again, Francis mentioned internal versus external. We're constantly reversing back and forth between those realities. McLuhan's prophetic words frame many of the questions being asked at this conference, and McLuhan himself was inspired by the writings of Teilhard de Chardin and was interested in Chardin's ideas. McLuhan, for me, represents something that's critical at this conference, and this is probably the most important thing for me here this week, and that is the recapitulation, the recapturing, the bringing together finally again the conversation between philosophy and science, a conversation that we have been sorely lacking in the contemporary age. And this conversation, as we know, started a long time ago. For those of you who have been to the Vatican Museum, you're very familiar with this large mural, the size of this wall or larger. And in the middle there, around here you see Pythagoras, Socrates, Euclid, there's a lot of famous people, but in the middle you see Plato and Aristotle. And those two, along with Socrates, frame what we call the golden age of Greece, okay? The coming together of what we now call the liberal arts. For those of you who are students of the history of the liberal arts know that it took about 1,000 years to develop, but essentially the seeds were sown here in ancient Greece. Now, for the Greeks, the idea of the liberal arts was the fusion of philosophy and the sciences. First, there was the quadrivium, the 4 roads, which were developed by Pythagoras first, and then Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle came along and gave us the trivium, the 3 roads, which were the higher, what they call the dialectics, the communicational arts. And the Greeks knew that if you studied all 7 assiduously every day, eventually you would become a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. So the quadrivium was arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Trivium was grammar, rhetoric, and logic, which simply breaks down as arithmetic, numbers, geometry, numbers in space, music, numbers in time, and astronomy, numbers in space and time. Grammar, of course, language, rhetoric, persuasion, and logic, reasoned validity. Logic comes from the Greek word logos, as you know. Logos has various interpretations or sedimentations, but what it really meant were not words, but for the Greeks it was words in their correct order. There was a logic to the thought processes, the internal, which then become expressed externally as logical sentences. But first there has to be an internal logistical validity. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was born in 1881 and lived until a ripe old age, and he died in 1955, excuse me. I see 95 up there. Boy, really ripe old age. He was a Jesuit priest who was equally well known as a scientist as well as a philosopher and as a man of faith. And I think he represents the epitome of this schism that we had between science and philosophy. And again, it's nice to see these two coming back together again in conversation. Chardin, as I noted, was a French Jesuit priest noted for his research as a paleontologist and geologist, as well as for his groundbreaking work on a unique cosmological perspective on human consciousness and the evolving universe. Specifically, his development of Vladimir Vernadsky's concept of the noosphere. While Teilhard expanded upon Vernadsky's concept of the noosphere, a word derived from the Greek words nous, mind, and sphera, sphere, so it's the sphere of mind, he also conceived of the concept known as the omega point, in which there is a maximum level of complexity and consciousness towards which he believed the universe was evolving. Teilhard's scientific research was notable as he was on the working team that discovered the Piltdown man that allegedly was the missing link in the evolutionary chain, a discovery that was later proved to be fraudulent. Not he and his research fraudulent, just the project itself. However, from that experience, Teilhard more actively pursued his burgeoning interest in paleontology and especially evolutionary consciousness. And he would go on to subsequently spend much of the next 20 years of his life doing research in China and writing his theoretical works on cosmic consciousness, for which he wrote 2 seminal books, The Divine Milieu in 1926 and The Phenomenon of Man in 1927. Both books which were banned by the Catholic Church and not officially published until after his death. I love reading any books banned by the Catholic Church as a lifelong Catholic myself. Figure they're on to something there if they're banned by the church. So complexity consciousness, I'm going to go through a couple of terms now. Complexity consciousness for Chardin is based on the observed phenomenon of the tendency of matter to become more complex over time and at the same time to become more conscious. Chardin was looked at it from a reductionist perspective. Creation is a random event that sprang forth unaided by any external forces. I'm sorry, that wasn't Chardin's view, it's a view. There's also a theological view, often referenced as the creation story of the universe, sometimes updated in the modern vernacular as intelligent design. And this view takes an opposite approach by ascribing creation's causality to some intelligent force, usually God. So the first model shows a random evolutionary process. The second shows a guided process. What we were looking at in our project this past year is a third story based on Teilhard's complexity consciousness and the noosphere, and it places evolution in a middle position, recognizing the randomness of the universe and the evolutionary process, while also recognizing that evolution itself does have a direction, okay? Not one necessarily pushed by some divine entity, but it's clearly going in a direction. The noosphere itself is the sphere of human thought enveloping our planet above the biosphere. It's significantly younger in terms of its appearance, thousands of years versus billions of years, but is definitely, as Francis pointed out earlier this morning, definitely we see lots of examples in the world around us. Now, the importance of the noosphere seems obvious since it represents what appears to be the next stage of evolution in which a new threshold is crossed, that of the unity of the human race in a global embrace of technology self-consciousness. It is this flashpoint that our focus was directed to investigate during the study that we performed this past year. In this study, we asked several scientific questions. The first, what is the scientific basis and evidence for this process in evolution? How well is it accepted in scientific circles, and can it be considered as a scientific fact? That's when we started to look at the known experts, Terry Deacon being our first, Bob, Francis, and others. We began compiling information, again, not trying to prove anything, but really looking at a feasibility study, seeing if there's enough evidence that we should continue investigating this. Obviously, we found plenty of evidence in just those 4 folks alone that I mentioned. Now, the scientific questions about the global brain and the noosphere were 4. Is a global consciousness the next step in evolution of the human race? What is the scientific basis and evidence for the process to date? Are there theories developed as to how this process works? Are there theories postulated as to the end result of this process? Again, there's lots of promise in all of those questions. We also developed a series of sociological questions looking at how these large forces, both technological as well as consciousness forces, affect the sociological and psychological well-being of people in general, young people in particular. We don't have time to go through all of these, but they're certainly an important part of the ideas and concepts that we were pursuing the past year. And we also are leading towards some ethical questions in terms of what are the ethical implications in the future for these ideas. The end result of, and let me just double check here, yes, like a finely tuned Swiss watch. We just have a couple more minutes here. Thank you, Bob, for keeping us on track. So for us, at St. Mary's College, as we continue to pursue this, our strength is in our ability to do certain kinds of sociological and psychological research as well as the philosophical side. However, that's not enough. We really need the scientific side as well, and we're certainly very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with Terry Deacon and others on the scientific part. For Chardin, I know for Ben Cassira and I and others who were involved in this project, Chardin was an inspiration on so many levels. But at this point, I would like to recognize my friend and colleague, Ben Cassira. If you could stand up for a moment, Ben, and let me introduce you. Let's give a round of applause to Ben here. And the reason is, besides being a supporter of our project at St. Mary's, he was also a benefactor of the conference here at Berkeley this week, and someone who really is passionate about Chardin and the work he has provided us. Would you like to say any word at all, Ben?
Thank you to
1 second, please. Not adjust.
Yeah.
Take a minute or two.
at the word of thanks to Bob Logan and you for organizing this this mini conference. Thank you to my friend here. I'm pointing at him,
Brian?
Brian Swim,
Yeah.
for organizing some of his students to come and present.
Absolutely.
Really, really great.
Yes.
And thank you to Francis for joining us. This is really wonderful to have you here. We've been talking about you for a long time. So thanks, and finally, he's not here, but thanks to Terry for organizing this wonderful conference, but then allowing the Human Energy Project to take part in it.
Do you have
Sure.
a question for Ed?
He's taken all my questions and answered them.
They're all answered. I do have one more thing just to mention here. We will have Brian Swim on next, and then we have two of his students with us this morning as well, Matt Switzer and Monica Duraps-Bole. So we'll be listening to them later on this morning as well. So it is exactly 10:30 by my chronometer here. Maybe I have time for one question or two,
I think
if
we
there
have
are
time
any.
for two.
If there are any. If not, even better, because I want to get to Brian here and give him his full 30 minutes. Very good. Then let me, oh yes, please.
We have a question.
I think I saw in your presentation talking about the idea of we're coming towards the noosphere. Curious in terms of, do you feel as if it is going to be, do you think it has not yet come? Do you feel as if technology or artificial intelligence is a necessary step for it to emerge or blossom? Or do you feel like it is already here and it's going to then be catalyzed? I'm curious sort of the difference between the future of the noosphere and the presence of it, if that makes sense.
It's a great question, and I think the answer is no, but it's a qualified no in terms of is it here. I think there has to be some sense of sustainability for this consciousness. It can't be just a momentary flash of cosmic consciousness and then it disappears. There's a longitudinal study that's been done at Princeton University that's had mixed results and certainly has a lot of criticism. But one of the things they've done is they've looked at some of the large-scale events that Francis was mentioning, the killing of Princess Diana as an example, and then they'll look at all of the various kinds of electronic communications that have happened, and they see these spikes, things. And then what they're looking for is if there was a pre-event that happened. Was there a spike in consciousness just prior to the event, and then as well as afterwards, much in the same way as animals sense earthquakes or other impending natural phenomenon. They're looking for connections between cause and effect. So I like Francis's model of, I'm thinking of door. I'm thinking of walking through door. I now activate muscles, I push door, and suddenly there's a direct cause and effect between thought and action. Not my action, but the door actually moving. And that's a sustained, coordinated activity that requires time to become manifest. But then for this to be a global consciousness, we have to have all people opening all doors at the same time for a sustainable period in order for us to say there's a direct causal relationship there. And I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're moving towards that. For example, you look at any kind of major event, suddenly you can track Wikipedia searches for information about that event. So certainly people exhibit these things on a global level, but is it sustainable, et cetera? I mean, there's some real questions that still have to be solved. Does that help a little bit?